So can you kind of walk me through how would that maybe change how we would set up a particular government program, a school?
Yeah, let's talk about a school. Let's talk about a school. So I think what it does is it takes us much closer to the methods of anthropology than to natural science. I'm designing a school. I will see if our editor can put in, at this point in our discussion, a picture. And the picture is a guy lying in bed with a thermometer in his mouth and a camcorder held in his hand. Now, what do you think he's doing? What do you think he's doing?
I'm not sure. He's checking a thermometer in his mouth and a camcorder in his...
Yeah, he's a designer, and he's designing a hospital.
Okay. Okay.
So he's trying to notice the hospital, to experience the hospital from the patient's point of view.
Perspective.
And when he gets back to the office and he puts the camcorder video and watches what's on the video, what do you think's on the video? Roofs.
The roofs,
There's nothing on them except light and vent.
Yeah.
And he thinks, I hadn't really thought about that before. So, and I won't dwell on this because our readers aren't Polanyi specialists like you are, but you can see that Polanyi would be kind of turned on by this because he's thinking of science as the most important thing about science is the creative act, the noticing act, the questioning act, the synthesizing act. And so that's what... And so if you think of knowledge as embodied, if you think of knowledge as ultimately purposive, then don't just go get a camcorder and show me lots of pictures of hospitals. You could have an amazing amount of information about hospitals, videos about hospitals, tables of, how many patients go through and all the rest of it. But if you want to make a hospital that is good for patients, which most people would agree is a good thing for a hospital to be, you have to build that knowledge. And it's entirely likely that all of the knowledge that you have about hospitals isn't built like that. It's like going out and building a bridge with a whole bunch of tables about the structural strength of materials when there are a million other questions about how you stick the materials together and whether they work in the cold and the wet and whether you can paint them and what they're next to and all of this stuff has to be constructed. And we don't think about that. We kind of know it. And if you point it out, people think you haven't pointed out anything. But I think you've pointed out a great deal. And so if we designed our schools by thinking about noticing, thinking that noticing, documenting, testing, varying around little things that you notice, and you become knowledgeable about this thing that you're trying to make better. Rather than say, well, here's a person with a PhD in education and he's the expert on this and he's gonna sort things out for you. Welcome to Uncomfortable Collisions with Reality, and on today's episode I'm going to be talking with a friend of mine, Martin Turkis, who is a high school teacher and a philosophy PhD, in that order, actually. He's been a high school teacher for a lot longer than he's been a philosophy PhD, but we met in a group which was in a Google group talking about Michael Polanyi, the philosopher of science. I'm going to pass to Martin to further introduce himself, and then I'm going to introduce what we're going to talk about. Over to you, Martin.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me, Nick. I've been teaching for a while and reading, studying various things, and finished a PhD in philosophy, focusing on the metaphysics of Michael Polanyi. My argument is that he was an undercover Platonist, though he may not have been aware of that himself. So book's coming out, I don't know, maybe in a year or so on Palgrave Macmillan. So I've I'm sure everybody will be rushing to the bookstore to buy the Metaphysics of Michael Polanyi.
Yeah, well, I'm sure that we've probably lost about 3/4 of our audience already. But
you can edit that out later. You can chop that later.
You haven't lost me, even though I try and steer clear of terms like metaphysics and epistemological. And I claim never to have understood what ontological means, but people have explained it to me. Anyway. So I thought that you would be a great person to talk to about something, which is that I think, in some ways Michael Polanyi was interested in this great topic of 20th century philosophy, which is the way in which we have become mesmerized by science as the paradigm of knowledge. So I'll just try and say a couple of things about what I'm not saying. And that's important because the 20th century was dominated, because everybody was so impressed with science, for obvious reasons. We should be impressed with science. Because everyone was so impressed with science, there was a kind of a land claim, a land rush for the credit of being scientific. Everyone wanted to associate themselves with science. And then there were all these other things that weren't science. Obviously, religion is not science, although perhaps some people, there are some ways one might argue against that. But obviously, religion is not science, art is not science, and so on. Now, the term scientism has been coined and was used by Friedrich Hayek and also Ludwig Wittgenstein, I think, and they meant something somewhat different. Hayek said that economics was scientistic, and a great deal of many of what we call the social sciences were scientistic, and what he meant was that they ape the methods of the natural sciences and therefore claim to be scientific. And so the study of society, or even the study of economics, is full of the kinds of mathematical and formal tools which people use in the physical sciences, in the natural sciences. And the idea is that if you do enough of that, the truth will emerge. And there's a marvelous quote, in fact, from Paul Samuelson, the great mid-century economist, who says that he thought that if you did all this stuff, eventually the truth would emerge, and eventually a kind of an understood truth would emerge from all this rigor. And he said, when he was in his 70s or 80s, well, that ain't true. We didn't get there. Wittgenstein, I don't know if he used the term scientism, but he had a similar view that we were overawed by science. And then, of course, a lot of European philosophers, I think Heidegger, not that I know anything about Heidegger, but, well, I think Nietzsche as well, have this idea that we have taken science as the paradigm of all knowledge, and it's paralyzed us, first of all, by constraining what we think of as knowledge, and then stigmatizing all those things that are adjacent to science. Now, I want to make I want to make a point, which is this, that we're constantly going on about science. It's always a good thing to say that what you're doing is scientific, but economist, philosopher, cybernetist, guy called Herbert Simon, distinguished between science and design. So, and I've got a little aphorism for explaining this, which is that science is about the universe that is, and design is about the multiverse and the version of that multiverse that we might want to inhabit and that we might be able to build. So if you're doing engineering, it's not... Now I'll back up a bit. So we typically think of science and then anti-science, the sort of Richard Dawkins, religion and so on. And both Karl Popper, who's more famous than Michael Polanyi, but also Michael Polanyi, were very focused on science and trying to say what is science and what is not science. And so they were thinking about things like, is Marxism scientific? Is psychoanalysis scientific? And that's not what I want to focus on. What I want to focus on is this idea that engineering is scientific in one sense, which is that clearly it's trying to deal with the universe as it is, but it is trying to make the universe different. And so it is trying to change things. And that, to me, is a huge... That sounds like... I can imagine some people listening to this and saying, yeah, you haven't said anything interesting yet. That's true, but so what? But I'm also thinking I should let you get a word in edgeways before I try and say a bit more about why I think that's significant. Have you got any responses to any of that?
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, Popper and Polanyi have come to pretty different conclusions about what science is. And then Polanyi, in my view, is more on target, not least because he's actually a very accomplished practicing physical chemist.
And his focus is on science, not on the demarcation. He thinks the demarcation between science and non-science is interesting, but his philosophy of science is a homage to science and is useful to scientists in some ways, I think. He's useful in understanding what science is. And in fact, the interesting thing is that the way Polanyi understands science as a process that begins in a subjective sense, in a range of subjective senses, and reaches for the objective. That's actually useful for engineering as well. The kernel of creativity is shared between pure natural science, which is about investigating the one universe that does exist and necessarily exists, and a process of engineering, whether it is trying to engineer a better social security system, whether it's trying to engineer a bridge. It begins in an act of creativity, not an act of objectivity. So I have to agree with you that's and we're in a minority, Martin, because most people think that Popper's a much greater philosopher of science than Polanyi, and Polanyi finished his life thinking that Popper was pretty useless, actually, which is roughly what I think.
Yeah, and Wittgenstein apparently threatened him with a fire poker.
With a poker, that's right.
He took it a little further even than Polanyi.
Yeah, well, I know a person who has written some very great biographies of philosophers, living and dead, and he was asked by his publisher to write a biography of Popper, and he was interested in this, and he spent a day with Popper, and after he spent the day with Popper, he said to his publisher, "There's no way I want to write a biography of that man. One has to have some sympathy for one's subject."
That's great. I suppose you can't say who the friend. You can't say the friend's name.
Well, I'll send you off camera. But the other great line, of course, which is well known, is that Popper's book should have been called "The Open Society" by one of its enemies.
Yeah,
because Popper really cared whether you agreed with him or not. He cared about that much more than the Open Society and good debate and all those kinds of things.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and so I mean, one thing that I would find it interesting to point out is Polanyi definitely, as I was mentioning before we were recording, I think in Personal Knowledge has some pretty significant sections where he compares technology to pure science. And he does maintain that there are differences along the lines that I think you're maintaining, right? Though he tends to be, Polanyi this is, doing so in the interest of trying to defend the value of pure science.
Yes.
Even if it doesn't have an immediately obvious way of being cashed out in engineering or technology. But on the other hand, and this is what gets me interested. So Polanyi's theory, which you know a lot about, of tacit knowing, essentially blurs those lines to some extent. It doesn't equate science with religion or with art. I think those are the two other spheres of human activity you kind of juxtaposed to science earlier. But I I can't remember, was it somebody, Simon, you said compared science to design. But one thing
Herbert Simon. Yep.
Yeah, but one thing that is interesting, and I don't know Simon's works, I can't comment too much depth on it, but that little nugget, one thing that it misses is that to do science, you have to do design. So, for instance, when Michael Polanyi was going to leave Nazi Germany because of his Jewish background and move to University of Manchester, one of the haggling points with the University of Manchester is he said, well, you have to pay for my glassblower to come with me.
Yes.
And you have to get, and the problem they had was, well, we're supposed to use our union glassblowers here. And Polanyi's response was, there's only one human being in the world who can blow the glass tubes that I need to do the particular experiments that you want me to come and do there. And so he has to come, and he has to at least, they ended up, I think, compromising. The German glassblower could come and work in Manchester for a year in order to train a British glassblower to do the work, which is another interesting element of that tacit handoff, right?
Yeah.
Of the
it
tacit
is.
know-how.
Yeah.
But that's just something that often in the public's perception of science gets lost. So, I mean, what's a modern example? The Hadron Collider.
Yes.
That had to be designed and built built to spec. So there's that blurring of the lines, which I think is of interest, and that's all in Polanyi. Whereas Popper's demarcation would just never be able to handle that.
Yeah.
That messiness on the edges, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've just a couple of things. These are kind of asides, but firstly, the fact that you've also told me about that Polanyi had some patents, and do you know that the very first the whole origin of patents is tied up with glassblowing in Venice.
I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah. So the Venetians developed patents, and they, I think what they were both trying to attract glassblowers and keep them in Venice, and so they got various kinds of patents on their skills, and it was all about trying to close up the Venetians' control of glassblowing technology. The other thing about Polanyi saying I've got to have my glassblower, it's just there's no really direct connection. It just reminded me that he sounded like Frank Lloyd Wright, who, having designed the Guggenheim and been told that he would need a door down in the basement that was at least so high, and he basically just ignored the instructions, and they said, how do we get the Jackson Pollocks in? And he said, well, cut them in half. So he had a solution to that. Anyway, so let me then go on to the point that I'm trying to make, which is that the more I've thought about this, I got myself interested in an area of, it's actually, it's an area written by a guy, a bunch of people write about it. Some of them are philosophers. A guy called Andy Clark at the University of Edinburgh is one of them, and some of them are roboticists. And this is the field of embodied cognition. And embodied cognition looks at the way we actually do things. And of course, this is close to Polanyi because, as some people who are watching this know, Polanyi's name is synonymous with this thing you've already mentioned, tacit knowledge, this fact that there are so many things that we do, including the way in which I'm choosing to arrange words in a particular order in this sentence, and I have no idea how I'm doing any of this, but I'm managing to encode the words and the sounds in such a way that it actually conveys some meaning, and all of that is a complete mystery to me, as is exactly how I walk, how I throw a ball, how I understand a facial expression, how I understand that your children have a family resemblance to you, something that Wittgenstein wrote about, and so on. These are all incredibly important, and in some ways more important parts of our knowledge than the formal bits of knowledge that we get to write down there. Everything we do is based on those things. And and then and this brings us back, I think, in some ways to your example of the design that goes into science. We acquire the best way to make this point, I think, is those rather ghastly experiments that people did on cats in the 1950s. You know, these experiments where they immobilized a cat's head in the first 3 weeks of its life, and all it could see was vertical lines while it is being fed and kept alive, and its visual field, and of course it's not just the eyes, but the eyes and the brain as a system, get to see visual lines, and then they let the cat go and teach it to walk and stuff, and it can't see horizontal lines. It bumps into anything that's horizontal and it can see things that are vertical. Now, what's the point of that example? Well, the point of it is that our senses do not give us objective information about anything. Our senses help us interact with the world. That's true of a bison wandering through the prairie, wondering if a cougar's going to try and take a piece out of it, if some Indians are after it, if it can stand on the mud near a creek and drink from the creek. It sees all these things, in the words of the psychologist who thought about a lot of this stuff over his lifetime leading to the 70s, a guy called J.J. Gibson. It sees the world in terms of affordances. So it doesn't say the world is a set of objective facts. It says the world consists of creeks, and creeks have got water in them, which I need to drink, and they've got a side where the water stops and I need to stand. That is and if I'm going to stand on it and I just disappear into the creek, it's not much use to me. So everything is seen in terms of what it affords us to, if you like, lead a better life, which can mean as much as get a drink right now. And then you generalize from there. Now, what I'm getting at, therefore, is that science conceives of itself as simply a set of propositions, which are approximations to reality. We know that it is a much better reflection of reality to say that the Earth goes round the sun than that the sun goes round the Earth. And maybe we'll revise that in some way or other at some stage. I'm sure it won't get back to the reverse of that, but we'll have more to say about it. But that is a passive definition of a state of affairs, and it sort of doesn't really concern us. If we're trying to send a rocket to the moon or to Mars, it does concern us. But we will want to know. But the problem will be that if we just read what we can find out by people who were just trying to figure out what was happening, there will be a vast amount of knowledge that's not available to us, like how you slow down the rocket when you've got there. And that's the engineering part. And what I'm saying is that's more fundamental than science. Science is an input to that. And the way I said it to you just before we started was, you can know an incredible amount about materials and steel and still not have built a bridge. You actually need some stuff. You need some of that stuff to build a bridge, but the task of building the bridge is a world in itself, which defines what you need to know and what you need to do. And we don't really get that. We have this idea, and I'm thinking, well, I won't go on any further, but I just finished a discussion with someone recently about well-being in policy, and the idea is if you measure it, you'll be able to improve well-being, and that's not true. You have to measure it precisely in order to improve it, and that's so saying we should measure well-being to improve well-being is like saying we should know everything about all materials so we can build bridges. Well, we need to know some stuff about materials, but there's a whole lot of other things we need to know, and we need to shape our knowledge around what we want to do and what we need to do.
Well, this isn't something that I could cite research on, but it seems pretty intuitively obvious that, for example, just in human history, or even with the way, primates use simple tools like a stalk of bamboo or a long blade of grass to get ants out or something like that. Yeah. That there's that I guess it's design thinking or engineering hacks are prior to some kind of a more abstracted.
Well, they're prior
science
to
in the contemporary sense.
Yeah, I'd say they're prior to. They're prior to, and they're foundations, and in some senses, they're greater than. That's my claim. That's my claim.
Sure. Okay. Yeah.
For us, we are purposive beings. So for us, science has to exist on its own terms, and its own terms are to investigate the universe that is, not to speculate about versions of the multiverse that we want. But then that's what we need to do, because we want to, because that's its most fundamental thing for human beings, its role in getting us the life we want.
Yeah. No, I don't think I disagree. I don't think I disagree with that. I mean, would the term maybe be helpful to kind of flesh out so that, because for the most part, most of us or all of us to a significant extent, whether we're scientists or not, are concerned to a certain extent impose our own chosen teloses on the world around us, right? Or have kind of a human-directed teleology.
I'm just going to explain that to anyone who doesn't know what it or doesn't get your accent. Telos is, the end of something, the destination, the intended destination, something like that. Anyway, sorry, you go on.
Yeah, no. Well, so there are. Well, I'm a believer in natural teleology. Not everybody is, but that's sort of a part of the whole discussion here, right? That Polanyi's open to it, Popper's not. But that, I would say you as a living being are a teleological being in terms of just your body's processes. Yeah. Like it's your heart's beating, right? You're feeling hungry when you need some additional nutrition, and this is all to keep you going, right? That's the purpose. That's the telos or the destination. But then also you're interested in economics. And this becomes a more human chosen, right? It's sort of maybe a second order type of telos. It's not one that just, bubbles up in an obvious way from the physical elements of an organism. So you are excited about a new piece of policy that might come to fruition that you've had a hand in or something like this. So I think that everybody has a big stake in those kind of human directed purposes that may require harnessing different elements of the world out there in science. One thing that occurred to me too, see what you think of this though, is that, it's kind of cool to know things. So there's a certain sense in which a kind of an approach to pure science, to those of us who are interested in it, supplies a particular affordance.
Yes.
Right. Yes. So that when what was it, like the Galilean or Copernican revolution, right? Figuring out what's really orbiting what gives a certain kind of a satisfaction.
Yes. Yeah.
Which, and maybe that's a satisfaction that's not really at a basic level of something like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but it's also got its own affordances that it gives and so on and so forth. That may be more accessible to some than to others, but that's another way in which I'm kind of trying to play the gadfly a little bit and blur the distinction slightly between technology and science. Or maybe what I would say is I'm not convinced. So I think Polanyi would disagree with you somewhat, but I think that would be, from my perspective, in light of the fact that I don't necessarily think Polanyi quite grasped all of the implications of his own theories.
No, he was a bit impatient with some of them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I guess science as Popper conceived it, absolutely, I think, falls before your arguments. But I'm not totally sure that science is actually practiced most of the time. It still might kind of be
that's
on
true.
the borderline.
That's true that if you have a flawed understanding of what science is, then you will find that you will imagine to yourself that science is doing one thing and subtly it's doing something else. And I think that's sort of what you were suggesting. And let me unpack that business about teleology or purposiveness. I was looking in this essay this long essay that I've written on Polanyi to see if I could find it. It's a marvelous quote, and I think it's not there, but you might remember the quote. I can't quite conceptualize, but he says it's a sort of guilty secret of biologists that they feel uncomfortable talking about purpose because it implies that nature has got purposes. But he makes an analogy which might now suffer from political incorrectness because he talks about loose women or something. But the argument, so he makes. I'm just trying to. Yes, he says, okay, so we agree that we're going to talk about our body as if God didn't embed purposes into it, which sounds terrific. And that was, of course, the revolt against Aristotle, who I don't know enough Aristotle to be sure of exactly the claim, but Aristotle said that the planets move because they want to, kind of thing, and it's in their nature to move, and it had all kinds of stuff like that, and that all got thrown out. And then we said, well, we'll have to do that with biology too. We can't say that the heart pumps blood because the heart, its telos is to pump blood, but hang on a minute, its telos is to pump blood. It wouldn't have evolved. It evolved to pump blood.
Right.
And so the thing is just saturated with purpose. And so again, design is the more, if we're going to go with this distinction between design and science, design is the big fact. When I'm a bison and I'm having a drink at the creek, then I'm in a live situation. There's nothing objective about any of that. I'm having a drink. I'm going to try to avoid anyone who's trying to kill me, and I need to get that drink because if I don't drink in the next 48 hours, I'll be dead or I won't be able to feed my calf or whatever. So that's knowledge embodied, and that. It's knowledge embodied, and it's knowledge that is purposive. And I think, talking about teleology, which is not just purposive, but it sort of implies some external purposes, or it does to some people, and it implies an end. Well, most of our own experiences of purposes are that they are not ends; they're temporary purposes. Like I need to have dinner, I need to go to sleep, and then we invent purposes, by going to church or deciding on humanistic, what we want our life to stand for or whatever. But the really urgent stuff may not be teleological, but it certainly is purposive. And so what's this all about? Well, that means that if we think that just by measuring stuff, that makes us scientific, no, it doesn't. And if we scientifically observe what happens when people try to accomplish something and do accomplish something, they construct their knowledge in order to accomplish it, not as some objective set of facts. And that's largely absent from our systems of government. I mean, we train engineers and so on, but we know that people are not really very well aware of this. They think of knowledge as this abstracted and pristine thing, this thing that is not saturated in human purposes and a product of human purposes. And if we understood that, my argument is we do a lot better in building government programs and doing all kinds of understanding what our task is in building a good school, for instance.
So can you kind of walk me through, so how would that maybe change how we would set up a particular government program, a school?
Yeah, let's talk about a school. Let's talk about a school. So I think what it does is it takes us, it sort of takes us towards a more it takes us much closer to the methods of anthropology than to natural science. I'm designing a school. In fact, what I'll do, so I'm designing a school, and I will see if our editor can put in see if our editor can put into this at this point in our discussion a picture, and the picture is a guy lying in bed with a thermometer in his mouth and a camcorder held in his hand. Now, what do you think he's doing? What do you think he's doing?
I'm not sure. He's checking a thermometer in his mouth and a camcorder in his.
Yeah, he's a designer, he's designing a hospital.
Okay. Okay.
So he's trying to notice what. He's trying to notice the hospital, to experience the hospital from the patient's point of view.
Perspective.
So when he gets back to the office and he puts the camcorder video and watches what's on the video, what do you think's on the video? Roofs.
The roofs,
There's nothing on them except lights and vents.
Yeah.
And he thinks, I hadn't really thought about that before. So, and I won't dwell on this because our readers aren't Polanyi specialists like you are, but you can see that Polanyi would be kind of turned on by this because he's thinking of science as the most important thing about science is the creative act, the noticing act, the questioning act, the synthesizing act. And so that's what. And so if you think of knowledge as embodied, if you think of knowledge as ultimately purposive, then don't just go get a camcorder and show me lots of pictures of hospitals. You could have an amazing amount of information about hospitals, videos about hospitals, tables of, how many patients go through and all the rest of it. But if you want to make a hospital that is good for patients, which most people would agree is a good thing for a hospital to be, you have to build that knowledge. And it's entirely likely that all of the knowledge that you have about hospitals isn't built like that. It's like going out and building a bridge with a whole bunch of tables about the structural strength of materials when there are a million other questions about how you stick the materials together and whether they work in the cold and the wet and whether you can paint them and what they're next to. And all of this stuff has to be constructed. Yeah. And we don't think about that. We kind of know it. And if you point it out, people think you haven't pointed out anything. But I think you've pointed out a great deal. And so if we designed our schools by thinking about noticing, thinking that noticing, documenting, testing, varying around little things that you notice, and you become knowledgeable about this thing that you're trying to make better. Rather than say, well, here's a person with a PhD in education and he's the expert on this and he's going to sort things out for you. Yeah. I think I've made my case rather well.
As you were talking, I thought of a humorous example that maybe might fall on the south side of the political correctness for some people, but an architect friend of mine who designed or had a hand in designing the bus stops here in San Francisco. Mentioned, I think he was talking about the bus stops, but he might have been talking about some other project he worked on. He talking about materials and the type of knowledge that I think you're getting at. He said you have to take into account the chemical effects of bum piss on certain parts of the structure, i.e. places where, people are going to go relieve themselves. There's a little tucked away area.
You have this word bum, you mean homeless people. Really.
Yeah. Though I think plenty of people with homes have relieved themselves in a variety of places as well. But I remember chuckling at the time. It was mentioned in passing, thinking like I never would have thought of that.
Well,
as relevant.
I was speaking to the state librarian in Victoria, so a woman who ran the State Library of Victoria. Victoria is one of the state, Melbourne's the second biggest city, will soon be the biggest. And she said one of the main issues, this is quite a good example actually, one of the main an important issue for her is, of course, that homeless people want to sleep in the library, and they come in and they loiter. It's warm and all the rest of it. Now, Melbourne's a relatively warm place compared with various places in the United States, but it's roughly San Francisco's weather, and San Francisco gets cold, and so does Melbourne. And so I'd actually, this is actually one of the things I'd thought about as far as innovation in government is concerned. When you notice something and the instinct in government is to say, we're a library, we can't deal with this. And that's generally what people were doing. I was quite surprised that this woman said to me that she didn't do that, and that she reached out to various homeless providers and located herself in an ecology of helping homeless people. It didn't involve them invading the state library, but it did mean that certain, they sort of looked out for them. They provided some advice for them. They communicated with homeless services providers and so on. And
that
again,
that's great.
Yeah. And, that's what we want. And and here's another of my bugbears, which is that both management and economics don't really think very much about, they're very comfortable with saying, all right, well, this is what this does. And we obviously have to have divisions of labour and demarcations, and that's it. And of course, I agree, we do have to have divisions of labour and demarcations, but maybe that's not it. Maybe when you notice stuff, you put it in your in tray, you don't let it upend what you're doing, but you nevertheless, especially if you're a government organisation, you nevertheless try to make yourself useful if you can in a relatively cost-effective way. Anyway, there you are.
Yeah. No, so one element of kind of what you're getting at is a certain openness to improvisation.
Yeah.
As you sort out what the real ramifications of what you thought your original purpose was, and you say, well, actually, okay, well, so we built this library, but it's a warm public space, and so it's attractive to this population, but it's not really designed to provide those services, so we need to expand our, that all seems interesting. So this makes sense to me.
It has to honour the kind of cost effectiveness of the original mission, and you may end up saying, look, by the way, I think we should split into two things, or you should give us some more money and then we will actually develop a program. The idea is that you have good communication up and down the hierarchy so that you have a responsive system, rather than a system in which we just sort of pump out these blocks of activity, and if something doesn't fit into them, it's just too bad. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, that seems to also connect to your interest in Toyota's
It does.
methods of production right on the factory line and so on and so forth.
And I think that's probably because that's such another good, juicy topic. We should probably draw a line under our conversation here, and maybe we can talk. It'd be fun to talk about some of the implications of Toyota. And I was always frustrated that Polanyi he hadn't seen it, but he doesn't say much that's interesting, but some philosophers adjacent to him, like the still with us Alistair McIntyre, have clearly seen in Toyota something very attractive, as I do. So why don't we adjourn at this point, and we'll take up either that or some other interesting topic in the future.
Sounds good.
Thanks,
Sounds
Martin.
good.
Thanks.
Yeah.